Lando Norris has made a lot of mistakes this season for a Formula 1 Championship contender, some big, some small, but too many if he is to grab his big F1 title chance. And while McLaren intends to give Norris full support to try to even out the qualifying and racing issues that are really hurting him this year, team boss Andrea Stella admits the conversations that need to be had could get tough. The raw numbers will tell you that Norris is having a perfectly good season. He's won twice, including the prestigious Monaco Grand Prix, has 8 podiums in 10 races, and is only 22 points from the top of the championship. So Norris is still in contention, and there are 14 races to go. The problem comes when you start to weigh Norris's performances against teammate Oscar Piastri's, and of course, dig into the context of the season. It's not just that Piastri has more wins, more poles and more points, it's the narrative behind that, the trends that have developed against Norris and in Piastri's favour, and how all of that adds up to Norris currently fumbling his first proper title chance. Norris has had pretty much everything he could have asked for in terms of McLaren's competitiveness. Okay, to achieve that has meant some changes in the car that have been tricky for Norris, which we'll get into more in a moment. But the point is, McLaren has created a huge opportunity and frankly a great likelihood that one of its drivers will be world champion this year. And prior to this season, if you asked people which McLaren driver would win a title in such a situation, the overwhelming majority would have said Norris. So why isn't it happening? The first problem Norris is facing is he's missing his big strength of the past, at least when it counts most. Throughout his F1 career, Norris has been among the very fastest drivers over one lap. Even last year, when he was clearly McLaren's lead driver overall and consistently outperformed Piastri, much of that advantage was rooted in qualifying. If Norris executed a clean lap, Piastri generally couldn't match it. That fundamental speed hasn't disappeared. Norris has been quicker than Piastri in 36 of the 62 practice and qualifying sessions this year, and when hooked up, Norris has been sensational, including in Monaco. But too often, Norris is fumbling his crucial last laps. There was the compromised sprint qualifying lap in China that left him 6th, the Q3 mistakes in Bahrain, the crash at the start of Q3 in Saudi Arabia, and most recently in Canada, 2 separate Q3 mistakes that left him 7th. A closer look reveals just how stark the drop-off in qualifying is. Norris has outpaced Piastri 9 times out of 12 in Q1 or SQ1 in a sprint weekend by just under a tenth of a second on average. In Q2 and SQ2, he's been faster 8 times, again by just under a tenth. But in Q3 or SQ3, Norris has only been ahead 4 times out of 12, with an average deficit of 0.16 seconds. It's not just when it's super tight between them and the margin for error is minimal either. It's happening on weekends where Norris has had the upper hand throughout and really should be more comfortable than he is. On 3 occasions now, Norris has been faster than Piastri in every single session until the final part of qualifying. In China, he dominated Piastri in both sprint and main qualifying until Q3 in both. In Saudi Arabia, he had a small but decisive edge until a poor misjudgment on his first Q3 run caused his crash. And in Canada, he actually had Piastri at arm's length all weekend, only to make mistakes on both his Q3 laps. Beyond the obvious errors, there have been missed opportunities too, failing to maximise laps that could have put him on pole in Japan or the front row at Imola. We tend to look past those because such minor missteps are inevitable across a season, but the major ones are much harder to ignore, and the consequence is Norris repeatedly leaves himself too much to do on Sundays. It's not a stretch to say Norris is still the faster McLaren driver, but this year he's simply not been a good qualifier. The obvious question is why this is happening. Some of it may be car related. We've given plenty of coverage to the fact both drivers have mentioned how the car doesn't provide a strong consistent feeling through the front axle. There's a certain numbness in its feedback that makes it harder to anticipate what the car will do on the limit, and at times Norris's driving style seems more vulnerable to that trait than Piastri's. Norris has told us about this himself in an interview you should watch in full after this video. Norris tends to want to carry more mid-corner speed and load both axles heavily. When the car becomes unpredictable, that approach can leave him more exposed to sudden snaps, particularly on corner entry. But the more Norris's errors have totted up, the more apparent it's become that they haven't emerged just from being caught out by the car. They've come from misjudgments, braking too late, asking too much of it, or generally just being imprecise. Norris has openly admitted to getting nervous in qualifying, and his honesty is laudable, but as this is elite sporting competition, controlling those nerves and handling the pressure is critical. So is it as simple as Norris buckling in that moment? And if so, is the trend an inevitable consequence because the more this pattern repeats, the more aware he is of it and the more pressure he feels under? Especially now there's genuine talk of a title fight and growing external expectation on top of Norris's own self-criticism. Whatever the reason, it sparked a cycle of repeated mistakes. One interesting element is that Canada was the first race with Norris running a slightly different front suspension geometry to Piastri. It's a relatively minor tweak aimed at improving the feedback from the front axle to the drivers, and designed to be something to help both, but it's not surprising Norris was the first to try it, or that he kept it on the car when Piastri chose not to bother. The early conclusion is that it has helped. In one sense, it's therefore a disappointment that this was on the car and Norris still made errors, and if he's guilty of overdriving, then the car setup won't change that drastically. However, it might be that there's a bigger benefit to come. Stella said there was certainly no downside to the new suspension that ran in Canada and actually characterised it as a successful experiment. But Norris thinks he needs a few more races to really judge its impact, and maybe even try to do some back-to-back tests with the original geometry to be sure. Even if that proves to be a factor though, it's also clear he needs to tidy up his own driving, and the car trait alone cannot be used as an excuse. Racecraft has become a bigger question mark over Norris in the last couple of years since he and McLaren became a more regular fixture at the front of the grid. A lot has been made before about Norris not converting poles into wins, and last season when Norris went up against Max Verstappen and came off second best so many times, it became clear that Norris did need to improve in wheel-to-wheel battle. He admitted that himself. Unfortunately, there is a growing number of cases of Norris simply not showing the same judgment and quality that a few others at the very front of the grid have. While it was no surprise last year to see Norris struggling to come to grips with the uniquely aggressive way that Verstappen races, he's also been exposed a few times this year too. You can excuse individual errors, as like with qualifying, nobody's perfect over a full season, and circumstances can play a part. Like going off the road when the rain came in Australia, or that first lap misjudgment in the sprint in China where Norris got caught out behind George Russell and lost 3 places running wide. But he did also nearly throw away the Australia win late on, running wide and letting Verstappen put pressure on him. That was a bit similar to his big near miss in Singapore last year while leading comfortably, potentially hinting he's vulnerable to unforced errors. More frustrating is watching Norris repeatedly try and often fail to pull off moves around the outside. In Bahrain on the last lap, Norris got baited into trying to pass Russell for second on the outside of the first corner instead of setting up a more straightforward and conventional pass using the DRS up to turn 4. And in Miami against the old nemesis Verstappen, it was a similar thing, repeating the same move unsuccessfully until it did eventually work, but quite a lot of time had been lost in the process. Piastri in the same race took a similar number of laps to pass Verstappen, but did so much more cleanly and convincingly, which meant he wasted less actual race time doing it. Then, of course, came the incident in Canada, clumsily and bafflingly running into the back of Piastri while trying to make a move that was never on. That was particularly poor for a driver trying to win the championship, but really was just an extreme manifestation of another well-established trend that again undermines the times Norris has demonstrated great racecraft, like the fantastic round the outside pass he did manage to pull off on Charles Leclerc in Bahrain this year. And that touches on what's so disappointing about the errors Norris is making this year. At his best, he is a phenomenally good driver and a potential world champion. He's just not showing that often enough when it counts. Against the Oscar Piastri of 2024, these Norris errors might not even be made, let alone be as costly. Piastri's qualifying step this year has been incredibly impressive. He is above his 2024 peaks all the time, he doesn't go missing, and his difficult weekends are being recovered. That's putting pressure on Norris, who now has a lower basement that's acceptable in order for him to be in front on any given weekend. And of course, it's put Piastri into a strong championship position, which is part of that wider narrative that Norris is trying to deal with. What's so impressive about Piastri is that a decent 2024 season still suggested he had quite a bit of ground to make up, especially in qualifying and in certain race conditions, and he's done most of this in a single winter. It was not unreasonable to expect him to eliminate his biggest deficits to Norris, but the uncertainty was whether he could really be on Norris's level in qualifying, and if Norris ultimately had a higher peak that Piastri just couldn't quite match. But that's more or less what Piastri's done. Sometimes he is just outright too quick for Norris, which didn't really happen before, and on Norris's best days there are a few hundredths, maybe a tenth of a second between them. Sometimes Piastri has had a slightly slower start, and his FP1 record isn't great this year, but his progress is usually rapid from there, and he's getting in the picture when it counts. Even if Piastri's not usually the outright fastest, he's been on the first 2 rows of the grid at every race and only qualified lower than 3rd once, Miami, where he won the race anyway. So now, Piastri's biggest deficit isn't there anymore, and consistent qualifying performances have been added to the qualities that he's exhibited in the past, incredible composure and a killer instinct. He's leaving Norris with very little room to make a mistake, let alone make several mistakes. Essentially, that evolution has combined with Norris's own frailties to make Piastri the best all-round McLaren driver at the moment, and leave Norris in a situation where the title is slipping through his fingers.